In the last episode of Project Scirocco, I replaced the grungy old front wheel bearings with shiny new ones, added new front axle spindles, and replaced the old CV drive axle assemblies. In this episode, it's time to replace the steering tie rods. Hey guys, what is up? It is time for another episode of Project Scirocco. If you're not familiar with my channel, this is the restoration of my 1985 Mk2 Scirocco. I'm the only owner of this car. It's sat idle for about 15 years and I'm trying to bring her back to life. Okay, so in this episode, I want to tackle tie rods. I have mixed feelings about doing this job. Depending on where you look in the manuals and what manuals you look at. The Haynes manual only talks about tie rod ends.
What?
They don't talk about replacing the entire tie rod. If you look in the Bentley manual actually does go into how to replace the entire tie rod, which is, here's an entire tie rod. This would be the tie rod end. Replacing a tie rod end is not a big deal at all. Replacing the entire tie rod is a little bit more of a job, and I am having some degree of hesitancy on whether I want to do this or not. The Bentley manual really kind of goes into a lot of procedure that you got to drop the steering rack, put it into a vise. If you don't do that, you attempt to replace the entire rod, you can potentially damage it, the steering rack assembly.
Are you serious?
I'm going to go ahead and try to replace the entire rod without taking that rack assembly out. If you attempt to do this on your own, please follow all the manuals and instructions in there. Okay, with that said, it is easy to replace the tie rod ends. It's a little bit more difficult to get all the way in to get this nut off of the steering rack. And it actually does require, or it makes it a heck of a lot easier if you have this tie rod removal tool. I went ahead and bought this thing. I've been playing around with it a little bit. This will go over, once the tie rod end is removed, this thing will go over the entire rod and get to this nut down at the end. And it's a universal kit. It has a lot of these different inserts that you can take in and put out depending on what size of tie rod end, inner nut size that you have. So it is pretty versatile. I'll leave a link down in the description if you want to attempt to buy one of these as well. Yeah, I guess let's get into this.
Let's begin. Man.
Okay, so let's see. This is the right-hand side, or the passenger side if it's a US car. And you can see here's the new driveline that I've got in. Here's the old tie rod. And you can see it's got lots of grease and grime and muck on it.
Muck.
This is where it attaches into the steering knuckle, which is down here. And that tie rod comes through the wall and goes into an attachment on the steering rack. And you can see the first thing that needs to happen is, well, a couple things need to happen. Need to remove this tie rod end, but before we do this, it's going to be somewhat critical that we maintain a general length of the tie rod, because I have done the entire front suspension. Everything is going to need to be realigned. So we're going to try to get as close as possible, and you know, once I get this car running, assuming I do, I'm probably going to have it just towed over to an alignment shop so I don't screw anything up. But we want to get the length of this tie rod on both sides as close as possible to the existing one. So before we take this end off, and this end is only held on by a nut. There's a nut right here. There's a nut right here that holds this tie rod end in position onto the tie rod itself. We'll loosen this nut off, but before we do, we want to do a scribe, or we want to be able to put some tape or do something to get a relative position so that when we install the new one, we're kind of in the same length. So the first thing I'll probably do is take this nut off. And then there's, as you can see, there's a boot, protective boot back here, and it's held on with a zip tie and clamp sort of deal back here. It's hard to see, maybe you can see that. We'll snip that off, pull that boot back, and then that's when we're going to get into using that long tool, which will then slip over this entire rod and get back in and be able to loosen up the nut on the steering rack. So with that said, let me adjust some cameras and get some lighting, and let's see if we can get this nut off. I'll go ahead and spray it down with some penetrating oil, because who knows when the last time this thing was replaced. Let's get into it.
Yes! Hell yeah!
A few moments later.
Okay, so here's the tie rod end. We unlocked the nut that was on the shaft. We left it on that shaft because that's going to give us a relative position when we put the new one on, to ensure that when we put this new tie rod end on, it'll be in the same relative length.
What?
It won't be perfect, and that's why we're going to go take it to a suspension shop to get a full alignment and have them tweak everything, but it'll be close. Okay, so again, we took this tie rod end off. Here's the nut. I don't want to move that. So what I'm going to do is get some sort of marking. You can put paint on here, you can put tape, whatever it takes to get a relative position. And all I'm going to do is use a little bit of blue painter's tape to secure the relative position of where this thing was. Okay. So there you can see that no matter what I do with this, I always know, or I know exactly where it needs to be to get relatively close. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is get underneath there and snip off the zip ties holding that boot on, and then we can get our tool in place and take the whole tie rod off. You know what, I'm going to leave this on here, and I'm going to cut that boot off, because we're not going to use it. I've got new boots, and I'm worried that if I take the nut off and pull the boot off, it might dislodge this tape, and I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut that boot off, and as soon as that boot's cut off, I'll be right back. Okay, so here's what it looks like with the boot off. Got our tape in place, and now we have direct access into the bolt that's holding it onto the rack. So now is when it's time to employ the special tool.
Proper garden tool.
All right, got it off finally.
That's what she said.
Excellent. All right, so finally used the tool. Actually was able to do it myself. There's the tie rod inside. Unlock this tool. It's got a locking ring on the side. Pull this down, and then this insert comes out, and there's your tie rod. Okay, Okay, with the tie rods off, here's the old one, here's the new one, and lengths are good. What I did is just make sure that these bolts, this is where I had put the old one, I just put the new one into the same relative place. I'm going to probably use this time some paint or maybe a Sharpie, because I don't think the tape is going to work when you put the boot over it. But there's the new one and the old one side by side, and the big thing is really to get the relative position of this nut in place. Okay, so here's the old tie rod, here's the new tie rod. Again, I wanted to make sure that I got the space from the nut interface out, which is where the tie rod is going to bottom out on, which is going to give us our best guess sort of distance to maintain what the alignment was before. Instead of putting tape on here, I decided to put some red paint, which is what I had laying around. I'm going to let that dry, and when hopefully I take this bolt off after the paint is dried and then slip the rubber boot over the top of it, it won't rub that paint off. I think what's going to happen with the rubber boot and the tape is that as I push it over, the tape's just going to come off. So next thing to do is let's go ahead and do the reverse using this tool, and now let's install the new tie rod into the steering rack at 37 foot-pounds. Let's see, before I go ahead and put this back on the steering rack, I'm going to go ahead and throw some blue Loctite on here just as a insurance policy so that it doesn't come loose during vibration. Okay, so there you can see that the paint worked perfectly. Sliding the boot over it didn't change any of that. And now I know that the bolt has to go back to here. Okay, that is all we have time for in this episode. I have got brand new front tie rods. Did the project go the way I expected? No, not exactly. Was it difficult to get them off and get them put back on? Not really, as long as you have the right tool. Am I completely satisfied with how the job went? To be honest, no. The perfectionist in me just doesn't feel like the alignment is there. It's obviously not. We got it close, but it just gnaws at me that I want it to be perfect, and it's not perfect right now. It's going to take it to an alignment shop. We'll get that figured out, and then hopefully that feeling will go away. But was the job very hard? Not very hard. Tie rod ends would be a snap. If you're thinking about doing the whole assembly, definitely get the tool. The link's down below. I don't get anything from it. It's just the tool that I used, and it seemed to work out okay. With the addition of the tie rods, that's the complete front suspension. Everything in the front is brand new. Woohoo! All new parts. So hopefully this will ride really, really nice. Next on the docket is to get the front brakes on, new rotors, new calipers, pads, brake lines, etc. As always, I really appreciate everybody that stops by. Shout out to my friends in the UK that have been watching. Nice to see you guys and hear from you, as well as all my US friends that are viewing. If you liked what I'm doing, maybe you think about giving me a like. If you're interested in more content, hit the subscribe and hit the notification so you know the drill. You'll be notified when I post a new video. Before I close out, I do have 2 toys coming on freight trucks. Should be here in the next few days. Been looking forward to playing with those. One of the items that I bought, I ordered several months ago. It's super popular right now, super hard to get a hold of. I'm happy that it's supposed to be here in 2 days. Look for a video talking about what that is. I've already got a whole slew of parts and upgrade projects that I'm thinking of doing with it. Should be fun. So please stop by and see what I'm up to. And we'll see you next time.